The Lord be with you. So I discovered quite recently that John 1 through 18 is poetry. And I also been listening to a Bible Project podcast on Hebrew poetry. And given that about a third of the Bible is poetry, I thought I would do a little lesson on poetry from a guy who doesn't like poetry. So those of you who don't like poetry but still love the Word of God and want to read the Bible for all it's worth, so I thought I'd do a little explanation of how poetry works. We've got a combination of Hebrew poetry and also a chiasm. And so I've laid out for you the chiasm. And the way a chiasm, it's from the Greek letter chi, where you've got this X-type shape. And you can see this with, it goes A, B, C, D, and then it goes C, B, A. And so you kind of got that half of an X shape or a angle shape with this. And I've tried to lay it out, and I hope to give you a Word document where you can print this out, because this is really tiny print. So what you'll see then is stanza A will match up with stanza A prime, and I have a little inverted comma. What do we call those? Apostrophes. Yeah. So A apostrophe is what I'm calling A prime. Okay, you with me? And then you got B matching up with B prime, C matching up with C prime. So verses 1 through 5 about Jesus are going to match up with 16 through 18, which are about Jesus. And so we've got this A 1 through 5 is about Jesus. B 6 through 8 is about John. C 9 through 11 is about Jesus. D is about us. Verse 14, C prime is about Jesus. B prime is about John. A prime is about Jesus. Okay, so that's how a chiasm works. You're going to match up the first and the last, and then the inner parts are going to match up as they get closer to the center. And the central point then is in the middle of, hey, we've been given authority to be born from God. And by the way, this is my translation. I hope it's not too weird, but it was done fairly quickly. But okay, so I'm going to go through this whole thing with you. So that's the chiasm part, which I don't think is normal in Hebrew poetry, using a chiasm. What you'll see is, oh, I didn't do this very well. Okay, there we go. This is A and A prime. So I'm going to start with 1 through 2. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. So capital A is the stanza, and then the small a, B, A is the lines. So what you'll see with lines of Hebrew poetry is you'll have short, pithy statements, and you'll have repetition. So the B and B prime are a good example of Hebrew poetry. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. It's saying the same thing in slightly different ways. Okay, or it'll say something that's complementary, or it'll say something that's opposite. So you'll get this, for example, with the C in verse 3. All things came into existence through him, and apart from him came into existence not one thing which came into existence. Okay, it's saying, I'm pretty sure, the exact same thing in slightly different words. Okay, so everything that was made, it was made by Jesus. There's nothing that was made that was not made by Jesus. Okay, I think I've got that right. By the way, there is a comma problem with the end of verse 3. The part that says which came into existence could be attached to in him was life, and you'll actually see some translations that do that. So let me do that for you. All things came into existence through him, and apart from him came into existence not one thing, period. What came into existence in him, in Jesus, was life. Okay, you could translate it that way. The commentary I had suggested the current way is the best way, but the Greek New Testament people actually put the which came into existence part with verse 4. Take your pick. I'm not sure if the Hebrew parallelism works. So Hebrew parallelism is basically this. What you're looking for with Hebrew poetry is short, pithy statements in lines of 2 or 3 things. So you'll get 2 or 3 things that either repeat each other, contrast each other, or build on each other, and we'll get a little bit of that. So we've got a small chiasm in verses 1 and 2. Note how in the beginning was the Word, matches up with A prime in verse 2. He was in the beginning with God. It's saying the exact same thing, right? A little bit of a commentary on the Word was God. Of course, you'll have Jehovah's Witnesses will say, oh, the Word was a God, to which I kind of want to go, how many gods do you have? That being said, if you look at the NET has translation commentary. And so, you could almost translate this, the Word was divine. If you understand divine as being having the same characteristics and qualities of God. Okay, so a better way to translate it where it's actually good English and good theology. The Word was with God, and everything that God was, the Word was. Yeah, or if you want to get into theology, they had the same essence. The Word has the same essence as God, because the current translation, the Word was God, it sounds too much like it's saying the Word was God the Father, which he's not. So you have to somehow translate it in a way that conveys that he's, has the same essence and characteristics as God without saying that is God the Father. It's a little confusing, but you've got that clearly stated. He's the God with God. So then if you jump over to A prime in verse 16, actually just dump down to verse 18. No one has seen God at any time, the one and only God who is in the bosom of the Father. He explained him. So you have in in stanza A, you have the God who is with God coming into the world and shining the light. In verse 18, you have the God who is in the bosom of the Father explaining God. Okay, are you with me? All right, let's go back to Hebrew parallelism in verse 4. Him that is in the Word was life, and note how the next line, the D prime, the life was the light of men. And then that builds, so it goes, in him was life, and then the next line expands on that, the life was the light of men, and then the next line, verse 5, the light shines in the darkness, and that's paralleled then with the darkness has not grasped it. A bit of a translational problem with what I've translated, not grasped. The word can be used for physically grasp or for mentally grasp. Grasp in the sense physically to control something. So you get translations like the ESV that says, has not overcome it. So it's taking in the terms of almost that physical grasp, metaphorically speaking, physically grasp. Then you'll get some translations, the darkness has not understood it, and with the mentally grasp. So what the New Evangelical Translation, the NET does, it says, the darkness has not mastered it. All right, verse 16. And I don't know what to do with this as far as the parallelism goes. Because from his fullness we all received, even grace in place of grace. And it's hard to translate that preposition in place of, and I forget all the different ways you can translate it. But I'm just going to stick with grace in place of grace, because the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And this is important as far as parallelism goes, because he's building on this idea of grace in place of grace, or grace on top of grace. As in, the law was given through Moses. Think in terms of a gift. The Jews would have seen the law as a gift of God through Moses to God's people. The law is a gift of God. It is grace. And you're going to see this in the Gospel of John, that the law of Moses is never that which condemns you, never that which shows you your sin. The law of Moses is always God's good gift pointing to Jesus Christ. So this is important, I think, for Lutherans, because I find this bad interpretation in, for example, CFW Walther, The Proper Distinction Between Law and Gospel, where he misinterprets this verse. Dangerous thing to say about the great Dr. Walther. But yeah, I think he just misses it completely because he doesn't know the Gospel of John. He only knows law and gospel and running everything through there, and lets his theology not interpret this correctly. All right, so that's the A and the A prime, and notice how he's, again, saying much the same thing in stanza A as in stanza A prime. He's building on it, okay? All right, let's go to B then. There came into existence a human. I didn't know how to translate that came into existence. There came a human. There was born a human, something like that. This word is found, I don't know, 50 times. That's an exaggeration. It's found a lot of times. It's the same thing as, in verse 3. It's 3 times that came into existence. So however you translate that, came, born, whatever. There came a human, having been sent from God, his name John. Oh, by the way, the human, I try to consistently translate that as person or human. It's typically translated as man. But it is a generic word for a person or a human, and I try to do that consistently because it does cause confusion. I'm not trying to be politically correct. I'm trying to be translationally accurate. So I appreciate that newer translations, the latest NIV does this, I think, pretty consistently, translates it human or person. And I think I've said this before, you have this awesome poetry in verses 1 through 5. And it's like, and there came a man sent from God, his name was John. And we don't realize, number one, you're going from stanza A to stanza B, but we don't realize how great John was. Of those born of woman, no one is greater than John, referring to John the Baptist. And note again, the parallelism, you got these short, pithy lines, there came a human sent from God, his name John. He came for a testimony that he might testify concerning light. These lines are just building on one another. He's kind of catching a word and then building on it from there, that all may believe through him. And then he clarifies, he's not the light. He came to testify about the light. This is going to be paralleled with B prime, stanza B prime. John testified concerning him, and cried out saying, the him, I'm trying to think who the him is, the light, the true light that came into the world. This is he of whom I said, the one coming after me, before me has been, for he was earlier than me. This is, I did this quite literalistically, the translation here. The one coming after me, before me has been, for he was first of me, earlier than me. You kind of have this double meaning that I think John wants you to have, where Jesus is ministry-wise and birth-wise coming after John the Baptist, but in terms of time and authority or rank, which I think a few translations, he ranks before me. He's before me in both time and rank, is what I think John, the gospel writer, is after. And by the way, I think you can see this because I go the chiasm, I go A, B, C, D, and then go up C, B, A. You kind of got that U-shaped if we were to read it almost backwards. Yeah. All right, C and C prime, verse 9. The true light which enlightens, I missed something, which enlightens every person was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world through him came into existence, and the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not receive him. And again, note the short lines, note how they build on one another or parallel one another. So in verse 9, we have the true light coming into the world, In verse 14, the parallel stanza, C prime, you've got the word becoming flesh and tabernacling among us. And that word that I translated tabernacle is not good English. But it is good Greek. He pitched his tent among us. This is the tent of meeting, the tent in Exodus chapter 40, where God shows up in the tent of meeting, what predated the temple, the dwelling place of God on earth. And if you want to see where God's tabernacle is, where God's temple is, we got tabernacle in 1:14. In chapter 2, we have Jesus calling himself the temple of God. We have seen his glory, again, Exodus 14, the glory of God fills the tabernacle, glory as the one and only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. Oh, I should have said, there's a textual variant in verse 18, the one and only God. There is a variant reading that says the one and only Son, rather than the one and only God. And that word glory, it basically means weight, something that's heavy, something that's weighty, something that matters, if you will. And so when the presence of God comes, it comes, in the form of the cloud. It is a weighty presence so that they cannot even minister in the tabernacle, cannot even minister in the temple with God's presence there. And then you have this sense of what we call glory, splendor, magnificence. And then finally, we've got the main central part. But as many as received him, that is the light, he gave them authority to become children of God. To those believing in his name, note the parallel between but as many as received him with to those believing in his name. And I would suggest to you the word received is a hospitality word. To give hospitality, to invite Jesus into your life and provide him hospitality, food, clothing, shelter, basically saying, he's now a part of my life. He's living with me. That's the same thing that you've got with believing. You're saying, this is now reality. This is the reality that defines my life. That's the way I take the word believe. Who are born not from blood, nor from the will of the flesh, nor from the will of man, and that's man, male, as in a male, but from God. And there's various explanations for, the blood and the will of the flesh and the will of, you could translate that the will of a husband, man and husband are from the same Greek word. Not from blood, which I would take to mean, it's not your ancestry. It's not because I was born Lutheran or born Christian or born a Jew or my ancestry is Abraham. Nor of the will of the flesh, which I would take to mean, decision theology, as in, I did not decide this for myself of my own power and strength. I believe that I cannot by my own reason or strength believe in Jesus Christ, my Lord. But the Holy Spirit has called me by the gospel, enlightened me with his gifts, sanctified and kept me in the one true faith. Nor of the will of, a man or a husband, like, I'm going to give birth to a Christian or a person who's a child of God. It's not the will of the parents. Yeah, but it's from God. God does these things, right? All right. That was my Hebrew poetry lesson for the day. And, maybe we'll do it again someday when we're actually doing more Hebrew poetry and no chiasms. The chiasm's kind of confusing. But this was a new insight for me. The chiasm was like, oh, I didn't realize it was going, Jesus, John, Jesus, us, Jesus, John, Jesus. Missed it. 50 years of my life, I missed that. Only recently discovered it. Amazing, the word of God. God bless.